In the spring of 1943, a train from Berlin arrived at the gates of Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp in the Third Reich. The passengers were silent. No one spoke as the guards shouted orders, their dogs barking against the iron rhythm of boots on gravel. Among the new arrivals was Elisabeth Adler, a 34-year-old librarian from Charlottenburg. Before the war, she had worked at the Berlin State Library, cataloging manuscripts and repairing bindings, a quiet profession built on order, classification, and memory. But in the logic of Nazi bureaucracy, her education, her Jewish ancestry, and her political record, a single donation to an underground book club, had combined into a sentence of deportation. When she crossed the threshold of the camp, her name ceased to exist. A guard at the intake table stamped a form and spoke without looking up. 8472. He tied a piece of coarse string with that number around her wrist. It was the last time anyone used her real name inside those fences. Ravensbrück was not a death camp in the industrial sense of Auschwitz, but it was designed for exhaustion, a place where the body collapsed long before the heart did. Thousands of women were forced to sew, wash, and sort until their hands split and their skin turned gray from lye and cold. The air smelled of soap, rust, and fear. Elisabeth was assigned to the textile repair unit, where prisoners unstitched the clothes of the dead to recycle buttons and thread. Every item carried traces of a life erased, initials sewn into collars, patches with embroidered names, sometimes a note folded deep inside a seam. She learned quickly that everything personal was destroyed. Names were burned. Cloth was repurposed. Memory, here, had no right to survive. But librarians are trained to notice what others overlook. In the evenings, after roll call, she began to whisper to the women in her barrack, asking who they were, where they had come from. Many refused to answer. Some had forgotten how to speak their own names. One woman from Krakow told her, "There's no use remembering. They'll never print it." Elisabeth didn't argue. She simply nodded and began to remember for them. On scraps of torn laundry tags, she started writing initials in pencil. When there was no paper, she pressed names into the fabric with a dull needle. At first, it was just an instinct, an archivist's reflex, a refusal to let order vanish into chaos. But soon it became something more, a quiet rebellion. Every day, the SS clerks logged the new arrivals by number. Every night, Elisabeth rewrote them in her own secret index. She memorized hundreds. She whispered them in order, like a prayer. 8327, Sabine H. 8341, Clara L. 8355, Anna Weiss. The human voice replaced ink. The mind replaced paper. The women around her began to help, one recalling the maiden names of those already gone, another describing the faces of those sent away to work detail, which everyone knew meant something else. Slowly the barrack became a living catalog, a library of memory, invisible yet precise. In July 1943, Elisabeth was caught pausing during inspection, holding a small tag of cloth in her hand. A guard ripped it away and barked, "What's that?" She answered without hesitation, "A thread count, Frau Aufseherin." The guard squinted, then tossed it aside. It landed in the mud. That night, after lights out, Elisabeth crawled back to the spot and retrieved it. The name was still legible, Maria K., written in faint graphite that rain had not yet erased. She dried it inside her sleeve. Then she stitched it into the lining of her jacket, just beneath the number 8472. That was the beginning of what later historians would call the silent catalog. At the time, it was just survival, a woman reclaiming the only skill she had left. But in that act, in those small, trembling stitches, she began to build the only record Ravensbrück would not destroy. Because in a place where every number replaced a name, she decided that names would outlive numbers. Chapter 2. The Silent Catalog. By the end of 1943, Ravensbrück had swollen into a city of women without names. Tens of thousands passed through its gates: Polish nurses, French students, Russian partisans, German dissidents, even Jehovah's Witnesses. All became numbers. The ink on their tags faded faster than their faces. But deep inside the textile repair hall, prisoner 8472 had found her own system, one that no officer could read. Elisabeth Adler had turned her barrack job into a cover. Each morning, she joined a line of prisoners carrying piles of uniforms and rags into the sewing block, where German inspectors sat behind tables marked Prüfung, Kontrolle. The women's task was to salvage what could be reused: buttons, zippers, pieces of cloth. But Elisabeth salvaged something else: names. When she found a jacket with initials stitched inside, she didn't remove them. She traced them with her finger until they were memorized. If a scrap carried a prisoner's number written in ink, she cut that corner and hid it in her sleeve. During evening roll call, she flattened the pieces under her cot, writing in invisible order: 1 row per barrack, 1 column per transport. Her archive was forming, thread by thread. The first version of the silent catalog contained just 9 names. By November, it held over 200. She kept them not on paper, but on fabric. Thin strips of linen cut from the seams of discarded clothes. To the guards, it looked like waste material. To her, it was the map of a human tragedy too vast to count. Using needles borrowed from the repair line, she began marking each strip with colored thread. Red for those who had died, blue for those transferred to labor camps, black for those missing after selection, white for the ones still alive. It was a color-coded library, built not from books, but from what the world refused to remember. At night, under the low creak of the barrack beams, Elisabeth sewed the strips together, row after row, into the lining of her coat. Each stitch was deliberate, small enough to vanish inside the weave. She whispered as she worked, reciting the names like chapters in a book: Maria, Iran, Nadia, Olga, Ruth, Jadwiga. The women who shared her bunk began to notice. One of them, a Polish teacher named Helena, asked in a whisper, "Why do you risk this? It won't save anyone." Elisabeth answered softly, her hands never stopping, "It will save the truth." There were close calls. Once, a German overseer spotted a thread of red wool hanging from her cuff and ordered her to remove it. Elisabeth smiled weakly and said it was from a damaged blanket. The woman shrugged and walked away. Another time, during an inspection, a needle fell from her sleeve onto the floorboards. She froze. The guard bent to pick it up, then laughed. "You women even steal needles now?" He tossed it aside. The sound of the needle hitting the wall was, to Elisabeth, louder than a gunshot. As winter deepened, the camp grew quieter, not from peace, but from loss. The crematorium chimney smoked day and night. The women stopped looking up. Yet every evening, Elisabeth lit a candle stub made of wax and shoe polish, its small flame flickering across the scraps of cloth laid before her. There was no ink, no paper, just color and thread. She began to embroider not only names, but fragments of stories. A red M followed by 3 tiny dots for Maria, who sang lullabies at night. A blue IL for Irene Lefebvre, who whispered poetry in French. A white dash under R for Ruth, who had survived typhus. Each symbol was a heartbeat caught in fabric. By January 1944, her coat weighed nearly twice its original mass. She could feel the hidden catalog shifting when she walked. Every step carried hundreds of lives stitched into silence. She told no one where the full archive was hidden, not even Helena. To anyone else, it was just a worn prisoner's jacket, gray, patched, unremarkable. But inside its seams lay the names of women who no longer existed anywhere else. And then, one morning, the rumor spread. The camp command planned a surprise inspection. All personal belongings were to be searched: coats, shoes, blankets. For Elisabeth, it meant one thing. If they opened the lining, everything would end. Not just her life, but every name she'd tried to protect. That night, she sat awake, staring at her coat hanging from the bunk. The candle burned low. Outside, snow fell soundlessly over the barbed wire. She whispered one last time, "If they find it, I die. If they don't, they live." And she began to unpick the stitches. Chapter 3: The Thread and the Needle. When the first inspections passed and Elisabeth survived, she no longer felt fear, only urgency. She had seen too many disappear overnight, a name whispered one evening, a number shouted at dawn, a body gone by noon. If her silent catalog was to outlast the camp, it needed structure, a system that even she couldn't forget. The librarian in her had returned. Each day, while guards barked commands and sewing machines clattered, she began observing patterns, transport schedules, uniform markings, the rhythm of numbers in the ledgers. Ravensbrück, like every Nazi institution, was obsessed with order. That obsession became her camouflage. When a guard demanded precision, Elisabeth gave them perfection. Her stitches were straight, her seams flawless. They began to trust her. And in that trust, she found space to hide what she truly worked on. She turned her archive into a code only she could read. Each thread color meant more than life or death. It carried time, sequence, geography. Red, dyed in camp, cremated. Blue, transported to a labor detail, destination embroidered by stitch direction. Black, executed or missing. White, survived to see release, at least for now. Gold, the rarest, women who helped others survive. Within these colors, she developed a rhythm, one short stitch for a week, two for a month. Diagonal for Polish prisoners, vertical for French, horizontal for Russian. It was a librarian's classification reborn in thread, a Dewey Decimal System of the damned. The work consumed her. She slept little, ate less, and spoke almost not at all. Every needle prick on her fingers became a mark of devotion. The women who noticed called her the one who writes without paper. One day, a French political prisoner named Claudine whispered to her, "You are writing us into history." Elisabeth smiled faintly. "No," she said, "I'm keeping the ink from drying." The turning point came in March 1944, when the camp received a delivery of discarded uniforms from Auschwitz. They were to be stripped of insignia, cleaned, and reissued to new arrivals. Among the uniforms were dozens bearing faint traces of numbering, 7 digits burned into fabric. The guards ordered the marks removed. Elisabeth carefully cut each burned fragment and hid it. Those numbers were all that remained of the people they'd belonged to. That night, she began stitching them into a new piece, a narrow band of linen she called the bridge. It joined her earlier strips together, linking the dead of Auschwitz to the living of Ravensbrück. Later historians would describe it as one of the earliest symbolic memorials of the Holocaust, created by a prisoner who never knew the word memorial. The act of sewing became ritual. Each evening after roll call, Elisabeth and 2 other women, Helena the teacher and Claudine the nurse, sat at the far end of the barrack, pretending to mend torn aprons. Underneath, they worked on the archive. They whispered, each contributing names and fragments from their memory. Helena handled the Polish lists. Claudine remembered the French. Elisabeth kept the ledger in her head. They had become a secret committee of librarians in hell. Then came the day the camp command announced inventory reorganization. Every uniform, every piece of clothing, every scrap of fabric was to be recounted and resorted. The silent catalog would be dismantled if discovered. That night, Elisabeth made her decision. She pulled a gray overcoat from the storage pile, a men's coat, far too large for her, and began sewing the entire archive into its inner lining. Piece by piece, name by name, thread by thread. She worked for 6 hours straight. When dawn came, she tied the final knot, a double stitch shaped like a cross. The coat was heavy, nearly 5 kilograms. She folded it carefully, placed it under her bunk, and whispered, "Now you cannot be erased." Weeks passed. Inspections came and went. The coat remained untouched. By summer 1944, she had cataloged over 240 names, each represented by a symbol, a color, a thread. None of the women around her knew how vast the project had become. They only saw her sit quietly each night, eyes lowered, needle moving through the dim light of a stolen candle. Helena once said, "It looks like you're stitching air." Elisabeth answered, "Yes." The air remembers more than paper. In July, as Allied forces advanced through France, rumors reached the camp. The Reich was losing. But in Ravensbrück, nothing changed. Transports still arrived. The crematorium still smoked. And Elisabeth still sewed, not for victory, but for remembrance. For her, the thread was not defiance. It was proof that even inside a system designed to erase identity, memory could still find form, thin as a single filament of cotton. Chapter 4. The Inspection. By the autumn of 1944, the women of Ravensbrück had learned to live without expectation. Every sunrise meant survival. Every night, a quiet victory of endurance. But for prisoner 8472, survival had taken on another meaning. It wasn't her life she fought to save anymore. It was the archive. 240 names now slept within the seams of her heavy gray coat. To the guards, it was just another prisoner's garment. To her, it was a fragile book written in silence, one that could burn in seconds if found. And on October 11th, 1944, that moment came. The announcement came at dawn. Full inspection, all belongings to be presented. The order rippled through the camp like a cold wind. Women looked at each other, eyes wide with fear. Contraband, a button, a note, a needle, could mean execution. For Elisabeth, the danger was absolute. Inside her coat lay enough forbidden material to condemn her and anyone near her. Thread, fabric, writing, it all broke the camp's central law. Nothing personal survives. She folded the coat neatly on her bunk and waited. Outside, dogs barked and boots pounded the mud. A voice shouted numbers. 8472. Hers. 2 SS officers entered the barrack, followed by a German overseer with a clipboard. They moved mechanically, as if the inspection were another inventory of furniture. All coats off, turn pockets inside out. Elisabeth obeyed. She placed her coat on the table, heart pounding so hard it hurt to breathe. The officer's gloved hands flipped through the garments one by one. A wool scarf, a patched shawl. Then, her coat. He pressed it flat, felt its lining. His fingers paused. The cloth was heavier than it should have been. "This one," he said in German. "Too thick." The overseer approached. "Open the seams." The air in the barrack vanished. The women froze. Elisabeth felt her knees weaken. The overseer took out a small knife, slid the blade along the seam of the coat, and stopped. Outside, a siren wailed, sharp, metallic, urgent. Another voice shouted from the yard. "Transport from Ravensbrück North incoming. All personnel to gates." The inspection halted. The overseer cursed, shoved the coat back into the pile, and hurried toward the door. "We'll finish later," she muttered. The door slammed. The siren faded. For a moment, no one breathed. When silence returned, Elisabeth collapsed onto the bunk, shaking. Helena reached for her hand. "It's over," she whispered. Elisabeth stared at the coat, torn seam still open, a thin thread of blue visible where the knife had sliced. She whispered back, "No, it isn't over. It's telling me to finish." That night, under curfew, she retrieved the coat and examined the cut. The blade had missed the inner layer by less than a centimeter. The archive was intact, but she realized how easily it could be destroyed. By a moment, a glance, an accident. So, she began her final version. Working in darkness, she unraveled part of the original stitching and rewove it tighter, blending the colored threads into the lining so that even if opened, it would look like the fabric's natural weave. She reinforced every name, every code, every color, each stitch now a covenant between the living and the dead. Days later, another rumor spread through the camp. The Allies were advancing, the Reich collapsing. The women dared to hope, but Elisabeth remained calm. Hope was fragile. Fabric lasted longer. She worked until her hands bled, refusing rest, her eyes strained from candlelight and exhaustion. The coat grew heavier, not from material, but from meaning. Each night she whispered a litany, 8472, remember, Maria, Helena, Claudine, Nadia, remember. By the time snow began to fall over Ravensbrück, the archive was complete, a sealed record hidden inside an ordinary coat made by a woman who no longer cared if she lived to see its discovery. When liberation finally came months later, she didn't celebrate. She simply handed the coat to another survivor and said, "If I don't make it out, keep this safe." No one knew her name then, only her number, 8472. But inside that coat, stitched between the threads, her name was there, alongside the hundreds she refused to let die. Chapter 5. Liberation and Silence. In April 1945, Ravensbrück began to fall apart. The discipline, the structure, the mechanical precision that had ruled every heartbeat inside its fences began to crumble. Orders contradicted each other. Guards vanished overnight. And then, one morning, the sirens didn't sound. The women didn't understand at first. No roll call, no shouting, just wind. From the north came the faint thunder of artillery, not the steady rhythm of German guns, but the distant roar of something approaching. Rumors whispered through the barracks. The Russians, they're coming. Prisoner 8472, Elisabeth, had stopped counting days. Her body was frail, her voice nearly gone. But the coat, her archive, remained hidden beneath her cot, wrapped in a piece of sackcloth. When the first explosions echoed from across the lake, the guards panicked. Some tried to burn papers, others loaded trucks with stolen goods. The crematorium fires were extinguished. The smoke disappeared for the first time in years. Women stood outside their barracks, silent, staring at the empty watchtowers. And then someone whispered, "They're gone." At noon, the first Soviet soldiers entered Ravensbrück. They were young, covered in mud and gunpowder, their eyes wide with disbelief at what they found. One soldier dropped his rifle and began to cry. Another handed out pieces of bread to the women, who didn't know whether to eat or hide. Elisabeth stayed inside. Freedom, after so much structure, felt unreal. She unwrapped the coat, smoothed it with trembling hands, and looked at the seams. Inside were the names, the colors, the threads, her entire life's purpose. Helena, still alive but too weak to stand, whispered, "You can rest now." Elisabeth shook her head. Not yet. When the Red Army began evacuating the camp, confusion followed. Bodies and survivors were counted together. Everything was collected, sorted, labeled. The Soviets recorded the scene as evidence. Coats, shoes, and blankets were thrown into piles to be disinfected, washed, repurposed. In that chaos, Elisabeth's coat disappeared. She searched for it for 2 days, limping between stacks of clothing taller than herself. Each gray jacket looked the same. Each one could have been hers, or belonged to someone she'd recorded inside it. On the 3rd day, she collapsed near the main gate, clutching only a single thread torn from a lining. She held it like a relic. "They'll find it," she said quietly. "One day, someone will read it." A medic placed a blanket over her shoulders. She didn't move again. When the war ended weeks later, Elisabeth Adler was listed among the unidentified deceased at Ravensbrück. Her name was not on any official document. Only her number, 8472. The archive she had built vanished with her, presumed destroyed or lost among thousands of confiscated items. For decades, historians searching the camp, records found no mention of a librarian, no record of the coat, no file under that number, just silence. And in that silence, her story waited. Nearly 50 years later, in 1993, a museum archivist cataloging textiles at the Ravensbrück Memorial Center opened an unmarked storage crate. Inside was a prisoner's gray coat, worn, patched, heavier than normal. As she turned it inside out, she saw colors glinting faintly through the lining. Red, blue, black, white, gold. Dozens of tiny threads, woven into patterns too deliberate to be decoration. When conservators unstitched the lining, they discovered narrow strips of linen, each less than a finger's width, with embroidered initials, coded marks, and numbers. 243 in total. The last one read simply, E.A. The press later called it the Ravensbrück Archive. To historians, it was evidence. To survivors, it was scripture. To the world, it was proof that even in a place built to erase humanity, someone had written its memory back into existence. And though Elisabeth Adler never lived to see it, her voice remained, not in ink, not in film, but in thread. A record sewn in silence. Chapter 6. The Archive of Names. Ravensbrück today is quiet. The fences are gone, the barracks rebuilt into fragments of stone and memory. Grass grows where once there was mud. The lake still glitters, cold, still, and indifferent. Visitors walk the paths in silence. Some stop before the memorial wall, where a single inscription reads, Den Namenlosen ihre Namen zurückgeben, to return the names to the nameless. But the story of how those names returned begins not with stone, but with a coat. In 1993, textile conservator Dr. Anna Reichel began cataloging a shipment of recovered prisoner garments at the Ravensbrück Memorial Archive. Most were routine, gray, worn, patched. But one coat, labeled simply unidentified, heavy, stood out. It was unusually dense for its type. When she lifted it, she felt the weight in her hands. Not fabric weight, but something else. During cleaning, she noticed faint traces of colored thread emerging from the seams. At first, she assumed it was repair work. But under magnification, the pattern revealed something impossible. Tiny, deliberate symbols stitched in order. Letters, dots, and color shifts. Red, blue, black, white, gold. Always in groups. Always repeating. The team began to document every thread. Each fragment was carefully unpicked, photographed, and cataloged. The work took months. Soon it became clear. The threads formed a code. Some marks aligned with known prisoner numbering systems, others with initials. Piece by piece, the symbols translated into names. Among them were women known to have perished in Ravensbrück, but never before identified. Others were transfers to labor camps, names that had vanished from all official lists. There were Polish, French, Russian, Dutch, German. Each color told a fate, each stitch a life. When the analysis was complete, they counted 243 unique records. Each fragment contained initials, origin, and coded status, exactly matching the color system later confirmed by survivors' testimonies. At the end of the sequence, embroidered in faint brown thread, were two letters. E.A. Dr. Reichel wrote in her notes, possible author or compiler. Initials appear deliberately separated from others, suggest self-identification. That small notation became the spark of discovery. Archival researchers cross-referenced the initials with deportation records from Berlin. Only one woman fit the criteria. Elisabeth Adler, librarian, age 34, transported from Berlin-Moabit to Ravensbrück, May 1943. Prisoner number 8472. For the first time in half a century, her name appeared on paper again. Not as a number, not as evidence, but as author. The press called her the librarian of Ravensbrück. Historians called her the keeper of the names. Survivors called her one of us. In 1995, during a public exhibition, the restored coat was displayed behind glass under controlled light. Visitors stood before it without speaking. The colored threads, faint but visible, shimmered like veins under skin. Next to the exhibit, a plaque listed the 243 names she had recorded. Below it, in smaller print, compiled by prisoner 8472, Elisabeth Adler, 1909-1945. Rediscovered 1993. Restored 1994. Decoded 1995. In interviews, Dr. Reichel described the experience. It wasn't just an artifact. It was a manuscript, one that spoke in silence. We realized she hadn't tried to save herself. She had tried to save everyone else. Today, digital archives across Europe reference the Ravensbrück catalog. Historians cite it as one of the few primary records of women prisoners created from inside a concentration camp, not by the perpetrators, but by one of the victims. In classrooms, museum exhibits, and remembrance ceremonies, her name is read aloud each April 30th, the day Ravensbrück was liberated. It is always followed by a pause, because that silence is hers. She did not survive to read her own name, but because of her, 243 others did.